The anime opens by introducing us to a 14-year-old student named Ganta, who is the protagonist of our story. One of his classmates arrives, and the protagonist tells her he was looking at his phone and checking out a prison called Deadman Wonderland, since apparently the students will be visiting it on their next school trip. The girl gets very excited since she had heard the place is like a theme park combined with a prison. At that moment, another classmate arrives and asks why they did not wait for him to have lunch. But since the boy is a video game addict, he ends up going to bed very late and always arrives late to class. They then chat about how they should make a trip to Tokyo before the day of the prison visit arrives. At that moment, the class bell rings indicating classes are about to begin. However, we suddenly see a mysterious figure who begins moving outside the building. Ganta at that moment starts hearing a song that sounds very familiar to him. The protagonist is then stunned to see the mysterious man outside the window, floating in the air at that moment. Right after the mysterious figure creates an attack which causes a massacre across the entire classroom. At that moment, we see the protagonist is the only one left alive, and the figure comes right up to him. The protagonist thinks he will die, and we see that after summoning a kind of crimson crystal, the figure ends up embedding it in the protagonist's chest. This makes him faint at that moment, and he wakes up several hours later in the hospital. The police immediately arrive and inform him he will be arrested for the murder of 29 students at Nagano School. This caused the case to go public across the entire country, and it is mentioned that of the 30 students, only the protagonist survived and was blamed for everything. The police then begin taking the boy away, and he tells them the man in red had struck him in the chest. However, when he checked himself, he realized he had no wound at all. This caused one of the lawyers present to think the protagonist is in shock after having killed all the students, so the lawyer tells him he will try to defend him in his case. After a while, the protagonist is sentenced to death for everything the other figure did. Ganta becomes desperate, saying he did not do any of what he is being accused of. However, several parents of the children who died started beating him. Also, a mobile device falls in front of them, projecting a video that shows the protagonist speaking in a very strange way. Since the video shows a confession of murdering each of the students for fun, and we truly do not understand who was responsible for creating this completely fake video, using the protagonist's likeness to confess he killed them. The video even mentions that he hid the weapon, and he starts laughing like a madman. This leaves the protagonist in complete shock since he cannot understand anything that is happening. The father of the girl, the protagonist used to eat with, feels very disappointed in him since she was his only daughter. And the protagonist continues insisting he did not do any of this, so the police took him away since people wanted to keep beating him. At that moment, the lawyer arrives and tells him that apparently someone placed a camera at the location and leaked the video to the press, so there is now no way he can escape any of this, leaving the boy completely desperate. In a scene change, we see a girl standing on top of a building when she notices Ganta is on his way. We then see the protagonist being transferred in a vehicle toward Deadman Wonderland prison. The protagonist begins explaining to us that long ago the old capital was destroyed by an anomaly called the Great Earthquake. So the prison has become a kind of tourist attraction to help rebuild what the anomaly caused in Tokyo. After arriving at the prison, the chief guard named Makina informs them the prison is maximum security, and at the same time an attraction for people, since apparently the prisoners are responsible for performing the shows that people pay to see at the facility. The woman begins giving them further instructions, and just then a prisoner bumps into the protagonist. He apologizes to him, and Makina realizes the boy stole something. Upon seeing he did not confess, she ended up making a cut on his body. Everyone at the location thinks the woman is completely insane because of the punishments she carries out. She tells them this is the real world and warns them that punishments for breaking the rules will be far greater. A little while later, we see the man who had spoken with the protagonist earlier, who is reprimanding Makina. We also come to know him by the name of Tsunanaga Tamaki. The man tells her it seems the girl went a little overboard with the punishment of the prisoner. She tells him the prisoner who bumped into the protagonist thinks Ganta will die very soon since the protagonist had equally been sentenced to death, so she thinks it should not matter since the boy will end up dead anyway. The girl thinks she should give the protagonist a little more time, but Tamaki tells her that normally when a person receives a gift, they want to open it immediately. With this example, he tells her he does not like to wait for things to happen. In a scene change, we see the protagonist is working for the prison when he clearly observes someone is doing some welding. This reminds him of when he was watching fireworks with his friends. The boy also recalls when he was being transferred to the prison since all the people started hating him from that moment. So the protagonist, because of everything he has experienced, thinks he wants to die. After saying these words, we see the girl we spotted a little while ago arrives to him. We also come to know her as Shiro. She tells him that if he wants to die, she could help him fulfill that request, so she picks up a pipe and starts trying to hit the protagonist. But every time he ends up dodging the blow. The girl touches Ganta's chest and tells him she knows he is lying and does not want to die. Also, the girl confesses they are friends. The protagonist starts crying at that moment and tells her he never tried to kill any of his friends. And just at that moment, several prisoners arrive and start picking on the protagonist. One very arrogant man tells him he cannot believe he carried out a massacre and now only wants to flirt with a girl. He knows that people like the protagonist are pretty disgusting killers. The man starts taunting him, making him feel bad, and the protagonist only replies he did not do any of that. So the protagonist makes the girl push him and she ends up hitting the man. However, one of the men hits the girl from behind with a shovel, knocking her to the ground. The protagonist also tries to defend her, but starts receiving a beating from all of them. In a parallel scene, we see Tamaki looking over the protagonist's files. He thinks the protagonist only has two choices, which is either to do nothing and die or push forward and become his puppet. Back with the protagonist, we see just above him an explosion occurs and a giant ball from the building is heading straight at them. This makes the protagonist think he does not want to die at that moment, and suddenly his chest begins to glow. Ganta at that moment extends his arm just like the mysterious figure had done, and finally manages to stop the ball that was about to fall on them. On the other side, we see a prisoner has another prisoner at his mercy, demanding he hand over a candy, since we apparently discover that the collars they wear around their necks have a time limit which indicates their remaining life. But right at that moment the man runs out of time, and we see the collar automatically kills him. On the other side, we see the protagonist is relieved to know he is still alive. Also, the girl wakes up as if nothing happened and asks if it is time to eat. The protagonist, very confused and not knowing what the girl is saying, agrees to eat with her someday. So Shiro gets happy at that moment. In a scene change, we see Makina watching the security cameras from what happened and is astonished to see a shadow, since she knows something is not revealed to us at that moment, but it seems to surprise her greatly. We also discover that the explosion was in part aimed to kill the protagonist and the rest of the prisoners, but it did not go as Tamaki expected. The next day we see the protagonist is in a cell and is very deep in thought, since the boy thinks that since arriving at the prison he feels completely let down by life. And a few hours later, the protagonist goes to see the doctor Rei Takashima to have his wounds clearly treated. She tells him he should eat a candy they gave him when they handed over his belongings, but the protagonist has absolutely no idea what the woman is talking about. At that moment we see the boy who had received the cut from Makina. He mentions perhaps it fell when he bumped into him, and the protagonist recalls that moment, and we come to know him as Chaplain Tsukigawa. The boy recommends following the rules if he wants to survive at the location, since anything going against them will make him end up like him. Just at that moment, Shiro appears and both boys get frightened since she appeared from the ceiling. She also tells them she wants to play with the protagonist with some toys she saw. At that moment, Yo says there will be a dog race as a show. Also, Yo mentions that the winner will receive 100,000 cast points. The protagonist, not knowing what this means, receives a scolding from the boy since all this information was in the prison guide they gave him. Yo makes him aware that these points are the currency used by inmates at Deadman Wonderland. He even mentions that without points he would not be able to eat at the facility, so he will have to work to get those points and survive in the prison. Unlike if he is lucky, he can even eat like a millionaire. And he finally adds that depending on whether he manages to save the points they give him, he could reduce his sentence. The protagonist thinks he might be able to participate in the competition, and just seeing that Ganta is hungry, Yo tells him he will give him food, which immediately motivates him to sign up without knowing what the competition involves. Just as Shiro was accompanying him, he is stopped by Makina. The girl asks where he is going, and the protagonist replies he is going to sign up for the dog race. She tells him to read one of the rules in his guide, since this prison is not as ordinary as he thinks. And after saying these words, she left the area. In a parallel scene, we see Yo passes the information to another person that the protagonist will be competing in the dog race. A little while later, the presenter makes the call for the audience to start gathering for the dog race. On the other side, we see all the prisoners are prepared, and we just spot that Yo is at the location. Also, everyone gets nervous seeing that a man named Kazumasa Kuzuji enters the place accompanied by several others. They wonder if the man will compete in the dog race. At that moment, Yo tells the protagonist that this man was a former gold medalist in Taekwondo, not to mention a champion a couple of times in mixed martial arts. However, the man one day lost control because a girl rejected him and he went completely insane. He also starts saying he is like a god at the location who everyone must respect. Equally, he grabs Yo and starts crushing his hand, which makes the protagonist look a little worried. The man even tells everyone he will be keeping the 100,000 points, and nobody should be ahead of him since he believes he is the owner and superior of all the prisoners. At that moment, the protagonist observes him beating one of the prisoners and thinks the man is completely deranged. But the protagonist let the words slip out and Kazumasa heard him. Two men immediately grab the protagonist, and Kazumasa tells him he should think much more carefully before saying things. He also orders him to smile or he will finish him off. Ganta at that moment thinks he considers himself worthless, so he has no choice but to do what he says or he will die. But despite doing what he is told, he ends up giving him a very good kick. Just at that moment, Shiro arrives and tells the protagonist she has some cookies. However, she accidentally steps on the man and he gets furious and is determined to hit the sweet girl. But just at that moment, Makina appeared and blocked the attack. She also made a small cut in his shirt and asked him to stop going around causing trouble. She threatens him, telling him he can come for her whenever he wants. However, he should know he will die trying. This clearly makes the man angry as he leaves, and the protagonist feels completely miserable for not having been able to do anything about it. After a while, the protagonist is at the start of the competition and just remembers having read a manual. Since it indicates the boy must eat a candy every 3 days which contains an antidote since the collar constantly injects poison into him, and if he does not consume the sweet, he will die almost instantly within 3 days. This motivates the boy to win the race. Even Shiro will participate as well. In a parallel scene, we see Tamaki is talking with a man about the games, since apparently he wants to push the games to the maximum level if something very, very bad is going to happen. So he only asks the man to clarify things for the public. After a while, the game begins and the protagonist knows he must win the competition. They pass through some hanging blades and the protagonist watches as one of them cuts a man in two. At that moment, he realized the games can actually kill all of them. Some prisoners tried to escape the games but were immediately finished off by snipers, so the protagonist has no choice but to continue in the games. They jump on a kind of bungee and the protagonist observed a man die in the fall. They then continue the game and reach a section where they must run without being hit by archers, since if they leave the path they will be electrocuted. On the other side, Kazumasa takes the boy who was with his guards and uses them as shields against the arrows. The protagonist on the other side passes several obstacles on some balls, and after getting to the other side starts feeling very bad since he tells the girl he does not want to die. The girl innocently tells him that sometimes you should not follow the rules to the letter. And after saying these words, we see the protagonist continued carrying out various extreme challenges until he finally reached the last challenge and realized he had seen all of this on his school trip. He also sees a group of students that remind him of his classmates. Finally, we see the protagonist's last opponent is none other than Kazumasa himself. The judge explains they must hold the Deadman ball until the game ends, so at that moment, we see the protagonist manages to get the ball but several floors collapse at that moment. The protagonist realizes if they fall they will land on very sharp spikes causing instant death. After dodging the man several times, we see he finally managed to corner the protagonist. Kazumasa starts telling him he saw on television how he murdered 29 classmates, but the protagonist, seeing he keeps being called trash, hits him with the ball at that moment. The ball falls into the girl's hands and Kazumasa furiously goes after the protagonist, but just then several columns collapse and the man tries to run for his life. However, he ends up falling on the spikes. On the other side, we see the girl was also about to fall, and the protagonist, seeing the girl was wounded from protecting him during the games, ignores the ball she passed him in order to rescue her, since the floor where she was standing was collapsing. At that moment, the protagonist tells her he does not care about the reward since they will have their consolation prize, which is their bread, so he wants to have it with her. At that moment, the protagonist thinks there was no winner, and while starting to feel a little dizzy, he knows morning will be the 3rd day, and he still has not eaten a candy, so he must do it or he will die. The next day we see Tamaki has a dispute with several important prison officials, since they mention he should talk to whoever is in charge due to the line the man crossed the previous day, since Tamaki practically caused a public massacre in the games. But the man very arrogantly tells them he is the person in charge, so there is no one who can tell him what to do. Tamaki then tells them that if they want to keep the wretched egg locked up, they must carry out these kinds of activities. Back with the protagonist, the girl, and he finish eating their consolation prize, and she very excitedly says goodbye to him. However, the protagonist knows this might possibly be his last day alive. On the other side, we see several prisoners were talking about what happened in the competition, since even Yo himself mentions they had never set the difficulty level so high in the race and wonders if it is because of the protagonist. But on the other side, the protagonist is writing a letter to the father of one of his friends who died in the incident. He tells him sadly that he probably will not believe him, but he swears it was not him. He also mentions he will be executed. However, at that moment, Yo arrives and miraculously hands him one of the candies that will save him, playing the victim saying he had lost his own the last time. This makes the protagonist cry with happiness and thank him eternally. At that moment, Yo, with a very malicious smile, realizes the protagonist now trusts him and wonders why Tamaki is taking such an interest in him, since just before Tamaki had transferred him as the protagonist's cellmate. He had also asked him to keep watch over him. Just at that moment, the protagonist eats his candy, but it tastes extremely bad. In a scene change, we see someone informs Tamaki that the wretched egg has escaped through a system failure. The man immediately arrives at the location and asks them to resolve this as quickly as possible since it poses a danger to everyone. On the other side, we see Yo invited the protagonist to have some ice cream. He wonders if he really did kill his entire class. The protagonist at this moment has a brief memory of when he used to go out with his friends to eat ice cream. Back in the present, we see the protagonist suddenly feels a pain in his chest, and after falling to the ground, realizes the man in red who caused everything is at the location. The man starts creating a kind of tornado which strikes several prisoners. This makes the protagonist angry since he thinks the man will also kill his new friends. So the protagonist starts using his new abilities, and Tamaki is stunned to see the protagonist can use something called the Branch of Sin. Ganta furiously launches an attack with all his strength which hits the man, but since the boy does not have that much power, the man in red simply leaves the area. The protagonist tries to follow him, but immediately falls to the ground without strength. This makes Tamaki go completely wild since he thinks the real Deadman Wonderland has now begun, and thinks the place smells strongly of blood, and thinks what he is doing for the other man clearly is not worth it. Since he considers the protagonist and the man in red both maniacs. After a couple of hours, the protagonist wakes up in the infirmary where he finds Shiro. Ganta recalls it all started with a pain in his chest. The protagonist realizes that just like the man in red, he was also able to summon his blood ability, and starts hearing several prisoners mention they recall seeing the man in red a long time ago, and there are rumors he is kept in the prison. This clearly makes the protagonist angry since he wants to get revenge for what was done to his classmates. In a scene change, we see Makina asks her guards for a report on what clearly happened. After hearing that Tamaki reported something different, she thinks everything is related to Ganta since he clearly has some kind of ability that works as a weapon. Everyone is astonished hearing they must capture the protagonist as soon as possible. She also tells them they are now entering Code Red because of how dangerous the boy can become. The girl finally tells them they will release a kind of robot which will capture the protagonist, but she confirms there has been collateral damage and prisoners have died in other occasions, causing everyone in the prison to go on full alert. On the other side, Yo arrives with Tamaki and tells him he does not want to watch over a monster like the protagonist. But suddenly, the man replies that seeing what the protagonist truly is, he knows Ganta is a full-on honored guest of the prison. This makes Tamaki hand over several cards with points, so he keeps following orders without asking too many questions. Also, we see that over the loudspeakers they are calling the protagonist, so he heads quickly to where they are clearly calling him. Just at that moment, several doors close and Yo arrives with the protagonist. The boy tells him they must follow the prison's orders or he will end up like him. The protagonist recalls what the chief guard did to the boy, so the protagonist asks if he saw the man in red the other day, since he must find block G to be able to find him. However, Yo explains to the protagonist that this block does not exist since the cells go from A to F, but Shiro tells him she knows the way there, though she acts like a complete drama queen. And immediately we see a security robot arrives at the location and starts pointing at the protagonist. This makes the protagonist beg the girl to take them to Block G, and she ends up clearly accepting, so she breaks one of the windows to be able to get to Block G. Finally, the boys get in just in time since the robot ended up firing at them, but despite this it followed them, and just as it was about to catch the protagonist, Yo ended up saving him. After running a bit, we see they have finally reached Block G. However, at that moment, the robot appeared again and launched several missiles at them. In the security room, everyone panics since they have lost communication with the robot and with them. This makes the girl tremble with fear, knowing they do not actually have full control of Deadman Wonderland. Back with the protagonist, Yo thinks his end has come, but suddenly the girl gives it a kick and destroys the robot. She also gets angry and tells him she is his friend and starts insulting him. Right away, the robot appears again and starts aiming at his friend. This makes the boy fall into desperation, thinking they will kill her. So he tries to use his powers, and just at that moment, an explosion occurs at the location and several branches of sin come out and cut the robot apart. Also at this moment, a man appears whose identity is not revealed to us at this instant. Both boys are astonished by what just happened. However, the protagonist at that moment thinks the man is the man in red, so he starts getting angry knowing everything he did to his friends. So he starts running toward the man and he asks if the boy is the woodpecker. At this moment, we are not told what this means, but the man uses some rings and after making a cut on his fingers summons the branch of sin, creating a kind of blood sword, not to mention causing several wounds on the protagonist. We then see there is a virtual call where they comment that the red crow of the wretched egg, also known as the man in red, equally refers to the protagonist as the woodpecker since both are dead men. So they are eager for a combat very, very soon. Also at that moment, Tamaki is informed the red crow has left Block G. Back with the protagonist, the man tells him he does not plan to fight until tomorrow, but Ganta, very confused, decides to attack the man. But the man ends up cutting the pipe he carries in his hands. The protagonist kneels knowing he will possibly be killed. But the man asks if he is the woodpecker, the kid from Nagano who killed his entire class, and asks when he plans to use his branch of sin power. The protagonist at that moment recalls having used the power before, so he causes himself a small wound, and the man in red thinks the protagonist is a total disappointment, so he starts leaving the area, and just then the protagonist starts summoning his power. This makes the man pay attention, and we see the protagonist suddenly attacks him with his branch of sin. The man tries to put up a kind of shield but receives the impact in his chest. This forces him to get very serious to stop the impact. After doing so, we see he starts laughing and thinks the protagonist was trying to slice his heart. The protagonist confronts him for what he did to his classmates and calls him the man in red. But the man tells him there is nothing red about him and confesses that the person who actually killed his classmates was in fact not him, since his real name is Senji Kiyomasa, and he introduces himself as Crow. The protagonist cannot believe at this moment that he was really the one responsible for killing all his classmates. Senji tells him he does not know who they are confusing him with, but that man in red and he are the only dead men in existence. Also at that moment, the man starts launching himself toward the protagonist to kill him. At that moment, we see Shiro steps in, and the man becomes completely nervous seeing the girl put her chest near his face. Senji at that moment calms down and asks her to put on her shirt since clearly she should not be wearing such a tight outfit. And the girl, as a good friend, starts defending the protagonist. On the other side, we see several soldiers arrived and fired tranquilizer darts at Senji and the protagonist, which made the girl furious with them. And a while later, Tamaki is informed everything has returned to normal. On the other side, Makina is reviewing the cameras and realizes Tamaki rebuilt the location quickly and left no trace. This makes the girl furious since she knows the promoter is referring to Tamaki and he is plotting something, so she plans to go speak with the director. In a scene change, we see Yo and Shiro are brought in handcuffed. Yo asks the guards why Block G is secret, to which the guard replies they are all dangerous and explains they are dead men with the branch of sin. Yo asks if it is some kind of disease or something like that, to which they reply they do not know much about it. Despite the guard's answer, the boy knows it is a kind of ability that lets them control blood. So he wonders to himself what kind of prison this is, and both of them end up locked up at the location, and Yo's point cards are even taken. In a scene change, we see the protagonist is tied up and Tamaki arrives at the location. The protagonist immediately recognizes him, and the man tells him they need to run some checks. In a parallel scene, we see Rei Takashima is talking with Senji. The man very respectfully does not like seeing girls showing cleavage since he blushes and tells her she should put something on. The girl immediately goes to her computer and tells him he has 2 broken ribs from the attack he received. So she mentions he will have to talk to Tamaki since he will not be able to participate in the combat. The man at that moment arrives with her and threatens her with his blades while telling her that even with 2 broken ribs, they should not joke about fights since he is a complete addict to Deadman battles. Back with the protagonist, Tamaki confesses to the boy that he planted the fake evidence in his video since he is quite the expert at bringing in people who have these blood abilities. This makes the protagonist furious and he tries to attack the man but immediately starts receiving electric shocks from the stretcher he is clearly tied to. But another man stops him saying he must be intact for tomorrow. Also, Tamaki informs him that tomorrow he will be starring in a show between the Red Crow and the Woodpecker. The protagonist does not seem very happy about this, and the man tells him he only needs to win and he will get many credits. He also adds that if he wins, he will have the chance to meet the man in red since he was the only one who let the protagonist live during the school massacre. This makes the protagonist furious since deep down he knew the man in red was there. Finally, Tamaki tells him he will only need to participate in the corpse carnival, which will be full of corpses. He then starts showing him a promotional video he made for the people since they are shown as beings who received an infection, which appeared 10 years ago from the Red Hole incident. The protagonist cannot stand watching the video of people massacring each other, so he asks to stop watching it. On the other side, we see Makina goes to speak with the director about what is happening. We can also see Senji is training and wonders if the protagonist's power was just by chance since he had never fought someone so strong before. On the other side, Tamaki shows the protagonist the video several times, so he understands that in the prison everything is serious. He makes him aware that if he wins the show he will get many candies to keep surviving, not to mention they will give him many cast points. He also makes it clear to him that if he loses he will die at that moment. The protagonist knows he will not beat Senji easily, and just at that moment the man opens a door and pulls out an eye inside a jar. Tamaki tells him that even if he dies he will still be valuable for study, so we can see that in reality many dead men have died. In a scene change, we see Makina arrives at the door where the director is. However, his bodyguards threaten her and mention they are not receiving visitors, so the situation becomes very tense and the girl has no choice but to withdraw. On the other side, we see Yo is thinking about what he saw from the protagonist. He is also lamenting they took his cards since he suffered so much to get them. At that moment, Shiro arrives and tells him they must find a way out to look for the protagonist. The boy replies it is somewhat complicated since they have sealed the exits. He also does not understand how she wants to look for him since the protagonist is extremely strong. But the girl a little sadly confesses that actually the protagonist is quite weak. Back with the protagonist, we see the show's presenter tells us the corpse carnival is a cage where the protagonist will fight against Senji. At that moment, the spectators who were connected through virtual means represented by animal cards think the fight is somewhat unbalanced, since they cannot believe they put a 14-year-old boy to fight against one of the best Deadman fighters. At that moment we see the combat begins and Senji pulls out his blades instantly. The protagonist at that moment causes a wound on his finger and runs up a tree, so the man at that moment thinks the boy is playing around. But Ganta starts attacking with a flurry of blood attacks, forcing the man to stay on the defensive. So the protagonist decides to use a bigger attack, but after being blocked, he starts feeling very bad since Senji tells him even a child would know what happens if you spend large amounts of blood. The protagonist at that moment does not know what to do since he feels terrible from the blood loss. So Senji takes advantage and cuts down a tree the protagonist was sitting on. All the spectators think the boy's end has come because of his lack of experience. Senji at that moment extends his blades even further and the protagonist takes a direct hit. On the other side, Tamaki gets excited seeing the protagonist is losing the battle. Rei Takashima at that moment informs him she has found in the protagonist's chest a kind of crystal similar to what they clearly found in the Red Hole catastrophe. Back with the protagonist, he has taken a beating and Senji asks if what happened yesterday was pure luck. The protagonist at this moment thinks he will die and has a memory of when he was a child. In it, he observes he actually knew Shiro, and the facility's doctor mentioned the protagonist was just a normal boy. On the other side, we see Shiro tells Yo that the protagonist only cries blood, but believes the girl is much stronger than the protagonist since she strongly kicked the robot. However, the girl replies that despite the circumstances, the protagonist never gives up against any adversity. We then see when everyone thought the fight was a total disappointment, Ganta ended up getting back to his feet and told the man he needs to live so he can find the man in red. So the protagonist at that instant pushes past his own limits, and we see the blood starts flowing through his body again, so he launches an attack at the man, which creates a distraction to finally land a direct hit in the chest on Senji, causing him to think the protagonist possesses an infernal power. On the other side, we see Yo and Shiro manage to get out of the location. Also, a man brought Yo some information he had requested since apparently in Block G there is a girl that Yo needs to see. And after a while, we see the two boys devise a plan to get back to Block G. On the other side, we see the protagonist is lying in his bed, and we see he turned out to be the winner of the combat. Since after eating the disgusting candy, the boy recalls that after defeating him, Senji showed him respect. So at that moment, the protagonist thinks perhaps they could become friends. Back in the present, we see a television announcement about what will happen to the loser of the festival. Just at that moment, Senji is strapped to a chair, and we see Rei Takashima arrives with him. She brings a machine similar to a slot machine, and after playing we see he drew the right eye, so they immediately bring several surgical instruments and end up extracting his eye, causing the protagonist to feel very nauseated watching all of this. On the other side, we see Shiro arrives like a complete maniac to the guards' room. This puts several guards on alert and they call the main base. But Yo happened to be right there and set a clear trap for them since he posed as one of the guards and asked them to cut the lights across the entire location. And without thinking twice, they ended up following the boy's instructions, not knowing it was a trap. On the other side, we see Shiro finished off all the guards and she turned out not to be as sweet as we thought, since apparently she has quite a sweet attitude. But at the same time, she can be the nightmare of people. At that moment, we see a group of guards arrives with the girl, but she displays quite a psychopathic attitude. On the other side, Yo thinks using the girl turned out to be quite useful since he thought they would catch him, but suddenly we see where they were with the guards. At that moment, a massive explosion occurs, making pieces of them start raining from the sky. Also, the protagonist is vomiting in a toilet while thinking he is now in his new life. Finally, we also see that upon seeing that the cause of the explosion was the girl, since she even has several parts of her body on fire. Even the girl at that moment smiles at Yo as if nothing had happened. So here we understand that the girl actually has a split personality, since on one hand she shows us a very sweet girl who cares about the protagonist. But when it comes to being serious, she becomes worse than a demon. However, upon seeing what the girl really is, she faints at that moment. This puts everyone in the prison on alert. And just seeing the director's guards arrive to take the girl away, Chaplin decides to continue with his plan. In a scene change, we see the guards who had stolen Yo's cards decide to buy themselves a drink with his points. However, he is stunned to see the boy has more than 90 million credits on his card, so they wonder how on earth he managed to get that amount of points as a regular prisoner. Back with Yo, he walks non-stop and wonders how he can get to Block G since he needs to see a girl named Minatsuki. On the other side, the protagonist thinks that despite knowing the place is completely rotten, he still has Shiro and Yo. At that moment, he hears a girl asking for help because a man wants to steal her plants to eat. So the protagonist comes out and offers his food, so the man leaves the girl alone. But the man even eats the plate and asks for more food. He lunges at the girl, but after she dodges, we see the boys hid in her room. The protagonist is astonished to see her room is full of flowers. Also, the girl introduces herself as Minatsuki and thanks him for helping her. The protagonist sits on her bed, and the girl apologizes since because of her, he lost his food. But the protagonist tells her he would not have had an appetite anyway after watching Senji's penalty game. The girl at that moment tells him it is not fair they make him suffer this way, since we discover the girl equally possesses the branch of sin. She hugs the protagonist while mentioning she is very sad about everything. Ganta at that moment gets very nervous and changes the subject, saying the place smells very nice. The girl suddenly unzips her back and shows him several wounds and mentions her father used to abuse her, not to mention she lost her mother in the Red Hole incident. And she then explains that one day when her father kept hitting her non-stop, she activated her power and ended up killing him. Also, when the girl was on trial, her brother did not know the great power she had, so he thought she was being falsely accused just like the protagonist. We also discover the girl is Yo's sister and the person he has been looking for. Minatsuki mentions she does not want to use her power anymore and is tired of making her brother suffer. At that moment, the girl turns around, and because a plant had caught her shirt, she ends up showing Ganta her chest unintentionally. Both get nervous, but the protagonist tells her they should escape together from the location. They immediately run out of the place, but since the girl was about to be hit by some pipes, the protagonist ended up lunging to help her. Also at that moment, some guards appeared, and they calmed down seeing it was them, since apparently the guards tell them to wait until tomorrow to fight. And the girl then confesses to the protagonist that apparently tomorrow both of them will fight in the corpse carnival. After a couple of hours, we see Tamaki talks with a man who is lying on a stretcher. He appears to be the director of the place, and tells Tamaki he should not go too far with the games, since apparently the promoter is temporarily in charge of the games, because the director is not in the best condition. But Tamaki, a complete maniac, tells him he only cares about watching the Deadman die and mentions that despite Minatsuki appearing very adorable, she is actually one of the best Deadmen in the entire facility. The next day we see the day finally arrives when both boys must face each other. The protagonist laments seeing everything ended in the worst way possible. However, we see the girl activates her branch of sin through her ear and in a lightning-fast attack manages to hit the protagonist. He falls to the floor as the girl mentions a knight like him will never be able to rescue her, so we could say she is actually quite unstable. Ganta at that moment is stunned to see the girl was not at all like he thought. The girl confesses she knocked over the pipes the day before to wound him so he could not flee from the combat. This makes the protagonist fill with rage, knowing the girl lied to him this whole time. So the protagonist activates his branch of sin and launches a powerful attack. After blocking the attack, we see Yo suddenly appeared disguised as a guard. He asked her not to hurt his sister. Chaplin is stunned to know she is also a Deadman, but the guards want to take him away at that moment. But since the audience is enjoying it, Tamaki orders the guards to leave him, and just then they open the gates of the location, and Yo says he plans to buy freedom with the points he has been collecting. The protagonist tries to tell him the girl has been deceiving him, but she approaches him playing innocent and tells him not to speak or she will make him pay. Also, the girl moves away from the protagonist and starts playing the victim, so the protagonist gets furious, and just as he was about to attack her, Yo stepped between them. The girl at that moment thinks she will kill both of them since she thinks they are a pair of fools. Just as the girl activates her branch of sin, we see Yo says he now understands she actually did kill their father because he recalls that when he arrived to be with her, their father was not actually abusing her as he thought. But despite this, the boy tells her he does not care about any of that since he is willing to protect her. The girl thinks her brother is an idiot for having a hero complex, so she starts insulting him. She also catches him with her branch of sin, and just as the protagonist was about to attack, she used him as a shield. At that moment, the girl starts beating her brother, and the protagonist tells her to calm down immediately. The girl, in a very manipulative way, tells him his friend has been playing him since he had been earning his trust with candies and other favors. But despite this, the protagonist defends Yo and tells her everything he has done was because he believed she was innocent. Finally, the girl managed to land a hit on the protagonist, and he thinks he must fight or he will end up dead. However, he knows if he attacks the girl directly, she will use Yo as a shield. The protagonist at that moment attacks the girl, and effectively what he expected happened since she used him as a shield, and Minatsuki thinks she will finish off the protagonist the same way her mother disappeared. Yo at that moment wonders if the day his mother died was because of her. But the girl confesses that on the day of the red hole incident, the place had shaken violently, and the girl had been trapped under several pieces of furniture, which she watched as her mother was heading toward her. But instead of saving her, she ended up taking a flower that was more important than her own daughter. Right after, the girl goes completely wild in the middle of the combat since she desperately wants to see desperation and death. But at that moment, the protagonist managed to land one of his attacks and freed Yo. However, the girl, using her branch of sin, managed to bind the protagonist's hands. Minatsuki, very confident, thinks the protagonist can now do nothing to defend himself. But Ganta starts moving toward the girl while telling her she is being just as worthless as those who treated her that way. And just after getting close to her, he headbutted her, which knocked her out at that moment. But all the spectators start telling him he must kill her. However, the protagonist insults them and says he will not kill anyone. Also, since he knows Tamaki is watching, he tells him he will finish him off. This makes even Senji, who is watching on television, smile, seeing the protagonist is a different kind of Deadman. On the other side, we see the director thinks the protagonist is a very interesting boy. Also at that moment, he starts approaching Shiro, whom he has at that location, and tells her he wants her to make his dreams come true since the Kuna song has stopped. At that moment, not much is explained about the subject, but the girl wakes up at that instant. The girl gets to her feet, and we see the man suddenly starts pulling out his branch of sin and begins attacking the girl while she dodges all his attacks. In a scene change, we see Yo is facing his sister who is on a stretcher. At that moment, the protagonist arrives and Yo tells him he looks terrible. The protagonist tells him it is because he had not eaten and had used his blood. Also, Ganta tells him he is sorry that now he knows the truth about his sister. Yo tells him he feels responsible for all of this, since he should have protected her from the moment their mother died. Suddenly, a strong tremor is felt throughout the location, and we see the stretcher where the girl was laying was about to be cut by several pieces of glass falling on her. The girl at that moment wakes up and recalls her brother had helped her in that situation, and we see Yo manages to stop a piece of furniture that would also have fallen on him. The girl at that moment thinks her brother is a fool, but he is glad that despite everything they are still siblings. The girl approaches and starts removing several pieces of glass embedded in the boy. Yo makes him aware he did not understand anything about the branch of sin and should have taken better care of her. The protagonist at that moment moves away from the location and feels a sharp pain in his chest. He then starts hearing a Kuna song and recalls he heard it a long time ago as a child alongside Shiro, so he understands this is the same girl he knew in his childhood. In a scene change, we see the girl beat up the director. The man reveals to us that she is actually the wretched egg, just like the man in red, since we see she puts on the same outfit she used when she carried out the massacre in the protagonist's classroom. After a while, we see everyone at the location is prioritizing rescuing people. At that moment, one of the guards pushes the protagonist, but Senji suddenly appeared. The man congratulated him for the great combat he had against the girl. The protagonist apologizes for what happened with his eye, but the man only replies these are things that normally happen at the location. However, he tells him that despite having won the combat, the protagonist's fighting style is quite unusual, since he tells him he has no more attacks than his Ganta gun, which is the weapon the protagonist uses to fire blood. The protagonist thinks it is something cool, and both recall a figure known as Ace Man, since apparently he was a very famous hero in Japan, so both he and Shiro played as his favorite character as children. Suddenly we see Yo comes out dodging several objects since his sister was about to shower, and the man as a good brother wanted to help her because of her wounds, but Senji for looking too much ended up receiving a hit on the head. Right away Yo and the protagonist arrive at the infirmary and the boy asks who Shiro really is. The protagonist tells him he had forgotten they were friends in their childhood. At that moment, we are shown a memory from 10 years ago where we see Shiro was very sad because her body hurt from various checkups and experiments done on her. But the protagonist, with his naturally good attitude as a child, would come to console her and make her feel much better. But the girl was not in the mood and ended up breaking her Ace Man toy. So the protagonist felt very sad and angry with the girl, and that was just when he saw his mother was chatting with someone else. But at that moment, a dog tried to attack the protagonist and Shiro came, and with a single blow neutralized the dog, making the protagonist get back on good terms with the girl again. Back in the present, Ganta tells Yo that since then the girl has been this way. At that moment, the boy for a few instants thinks about telling him what he saw the other day, but prefers not to do so at this moment. In a scene change, a guard explains the prison's new directives to the rest. However, Makina tells them it all seems very strange to her since 10 years ago the location was the center of the Great Red Hole catastrophe. And for the 6 years since the prison was built, she knows something strange is happening there. So she immediately draws her sword and tells them if none of them will do anything then she will, since she plans to go hunt down whoever is responsible for all of this. On the other side, Tamaki feels something very bad is about to happen. Rei Takashima at that moment informs him that the crystal the protagonist has in his chest is actually a capsule of femto machines with something added known as namelorm. And this material, when coming into contact with people who were near the catastrophe, infects them with this virus. Tamaki tells her he wants to produce carriers en masse, but the girl tells him there is no way to generate the namelorm material, since she mentions the only way would be to be able to examine the source of everything, which is the wretched egg. However, Tamaki is disappointed since the girl is the director's toy and cannot be examined, But despite this, he knows the director is gradually declining and very soon it will become his Wonderland, so he will be able to make his own rules. On the other side, we see that while Minatsuki is changing clothes, the protagonist arrives, and the girl gets furious seeing her half undressed. The protagonist tells her they should stop the punishments carried out after the games, but she only mentions she has already lost a kidney and part of her stomach. At that moment, the protagonist recalls the point cards Yo had told him about, so he knows he only needs to buy the girl an early release with the points. So while running from the place, a girl named Karako punches him in the stomach and tells him she expected him to dodge the attack. On the other side, we see Yo is at the lockers. When coming out, he runs into Tamaki. Tamaki is accompanied by a priest named Genkaku. Tamaki makes Yo aware that in Block G the points work differently. So since he sees the point cards in his hands, he informs him that prisoners there cannot buy shorter sentences. This makes the boy feel very miserable since he spent all this time saving up to free his sister. So he gets furious and trying to launch himself at Tamaki, Genkaku fires a burst of wind, attacks at him with a weapon, leaving Yo completely wounded at that moment. Back with the protagonist, we see he wakes up and in front of him is Karako. The girl tells him she is a member of Scar Chain. We also see she invites him to join her group, and just at that moment, a man named Nagi arrives. The man apologizes to the protagonist for how his companion treated him. He also introduces himself as the leader of Scar Chain, which is a clandestine resistance movement. Nagi tells him both have similar objectives since he wants to destroy the birdcage that is Deadman Wonderland, and they want to overthrow everything the director named Rinakiro Hajir created. Both confess that after the fight they thought it would be a good idea to recruit him. The protagonist at that moment thinks not everyone at the prison is actually insane as he thought, since both think the same as he does. The protagonist thanks them for the invitation, but stresses he is in a hurry to save his friend from the punishment. Just at that moment he is stopped, and we see Nagi pulls out a kind of communicator from his tooth, since just on television the penitence show is about to start. At that moment Minatsuki's game begins, and she is very annoyed with Rei Takashima. However, because of the call Nagi had made, we see the girl only drew having to remove her hair, which makes her cry with happiness seeing they will not take any of her organs. The protagonist is glad about this, but just at that instant they are interrupted when Genkaku arrives at the location. He brings Yo and throws him before them, which causes Karako to try to attack, but the man with his wind gun fires at her and causes several wounds. The protagonist equally tried to attack with his branch of sin, but they had no effect at all. The man tells them his last words, and we see he pulls out a kind of guitar which he will use as a weapon to finish all of them off, leaving Ganta not knowing what to do at that moment. Just when the man was about to fire at them, we see Shiro appears doing a move from their old hero Ace Man. Yo thinks he had forgotten about the girl, and that she is actually the real monster behind everything. At that moment the girl very calmly tells the protagonist they should eat pudding, but having destroyed Genkaku's weapon, he ends up leaving the location. After a long while we see Shiro sits down to eat pudding when a boy named Bundo Rokuro enters. He tells her he has obtained some information they were looking for and introduces himself to the boys. And after a while we see they are treating Yo's wounds. Nagi tells the protagonist that Bundo is the person responsible for collecting information and doing analysis, so the boy is a kind of hacker who saved Minatsuki in the penalty game. We also see Shiro is introduced to the rest of the group, and after a long while we see the protagonist is at the bar with Nagi and Shiro. At that moment Shiro orders a dessert and asks what she really is, since if she is not a Deadman like the rest, then she wants to know what on earth she is. But the girl only replies she has lived in the prison since always. The protagonist at that moment tells her that for being in a clandestine location, he feels a great deal of peace, to which Nagi tells him everything is going according to everyone's plan. In a scene change, we see that while Makina changes clothes, she talks with her companion Kyoko about an inspection she will do at the prison, since every year they review that the rules of a private prison are being followed. So she tells Kyoko they should hide the secret information if they want to discover what is really happening in the prison. On the other side, we see Karako explains the inspection lasts a week, and they normally do not hold any shows, so it looks like an ordinary prison. And Nagi at that moment mentions this is when they must take advantage and carry out a mass escape of the Deadmen. However, he makes it clear to the protagonist there are some figures known as the Undertakers who are people chosen by Tamaki to counter the Deadmen. The protagonist, a little confused, asks if that is why his branch of sin had no effect against Genkaku. Everyone at the location gets nervous since they think it is not possible they developed anything of this kind. Bundo at that moment shows them the masks and reveals the man actually only dodged the protagonist's attack. This makes everyone mock the protagonist and Ganta fills with frustration over this. So he tells them he equally has not confirmed whether he will join them or not since he calls them a bunch of vagabonds he cannot trust from one moment to the next. The protagonist at that moment asks Shiro to leave, and the girl before leaving tells them they should not have mocked him. After a while, the protagonist arrives with Senji and tells him he fought against an Undertaker. This makes the man angry since he is envious the protagonist is having the best fights. The man tells the protagonist that next time he goes to fight he should inform him since he is eager to fight someone. Ganta explains everything that happened with Nagi and Senji, explains that Nagi and the Undertakers have a very bad relationship with each other. This is because the Undertakers killed Naga's wife, since this happened 2 years ago when they forced him to fight against her in the corpse Carnival. He finally confesses that Nagi lost because he did not want to hit his wife, so they took part of his vocal cords, and since Tamaki did not like the fight they imposed a punishment on the girl, and since both tried to escape, Genkaku ended up killing the girl. And after a while the protagonist returns to his room and realizes Nagi is there. He immediately apologizes to him for calling him a bunch of vagabonds since he tells him he discovered what happened to his wife. Nagi tells him the members, despite being very calm, are quite serious people who know what they must do. Nagi also tells him he is not looking for any kind of revenge since he only seeks freedom because he had a child with the girl before coming to the prison. This made the protagonist think all night about why Nagi does not want revenge after everything that was done to him in the prison. However, he recalls he does want revenge on the man in red, and just then Shiro hears him. The protagonist takes advantage to ask her what it is she wants to do. Shiro actually replies she has always wanted to ride a carousel, so the protagonist promises her that someday when they get out they will go and ride it together, which leaves the girl completely fascinated. In a parallel scene, we see Genkaku is thinking about what Shiro did. Right then, we see a guitar is brought to him, and we discover Bundo is part of his group since they start talking as if they were friends. The next day, a female reporter on television talks about the events that happened 10 years ago and mentions the inspection by the Tokyo governors is coming very soon. Karako, who is watching the TV, thinks they are actually very close to seeing Deadman Wonderland fall. At that moment, Nagi arrives to chat, and they are briefly interrupted by the protagonist. Ganta at that moment apologizes to everyone for what he said the previous day. Karako gives him a pat on the back and tells him she knew the protagonist would return. Also, we see the girl arrives and the protagonist asks her to return to the room, but Shiro only replies she wants to be with him. Everyone teases him saying they would like to have a girl like her. But the protagonist tells Shiro to remember their promise about the carousel. Despite the girl not seeming very happy, she ends up leaving, and just before she did, Karako tells the protagonist he does all of this because he actually cares about her, which makes Shiro leave very happily to the room. Right away, Nagi starts explaining that the main plan is to get out and expose everything they actually do at the prison. Also, he and Bundo will be in the control room. The protagonist at that moment thinks he hopes that plan works so he can finally meet the man in red and Tamaki. After a couple of hours, we see all the alarms start activating and the guards cannot see what is happening. Right away, Bundo along with Nagi arrived at the control room and summoned their branch of Sin. On the other side, we see the group the protagonist is in managed to pass some security doors. But since the bridge they must cross is measured to the authorized weight and size, they create a kind of blood bridge, but just as they were halfway across it breaks. And just then a robot comes out which sprays acid on one of them, causing his skin to start disintegrating. Karako, seeing the bridge was equally about to fall, hands the protagonist the memory stick with the data and asks him to run since she will stay to buy time and hold the bridge, making the protagonist lament not wanting to leave his companion behind. The girl at that moment tells him everything now depends on the protagonist. At that moment, we are shown a memory of when Nagi assigned the girl as one of the members. The other members did not take Naga's decision very well since they thought he was crazy for making this type of decision. The girl at that moment had a kind of collar with a little bell, so Nagi came to the girl to tell her it was very pretty. At that moment, the man gave her a word of encouragement and mentioned he knows she is a very strong woman, since as long as her bell keeps ringing it means she will always have a friend by her side. Back in the present, the girl, upon seeing everyone has crossed the bridge, lets it go, and after receiving an acid shot, uses her branch of sin to cover herself in armor. This can absorb any type of acid without the girl receiving any damage, and she finally moves toward the robot and lands several blows which bring it down. However, we see the girl apparently falls into the void as well. On the other side, the boys successfully made it across, and we see they are finally in front of an elevator. They also wonder if the girl will be safe, and one of them knows they will find a way to get out alive. The men tell the protagonist everyone now trusts him to complete the plan. They also confess they have been creating a distraction to prevent them from being tracked. Finally, they know that for the elevator to go down, they mainly depend on Nagi and Bundo. On the other side, we see the boys manage to finish off all the guards. However, we see that suddenly a little girl appeared in front of them. Nagi comes to the girl, and we see she behaves in a very polite manner. The man asks if she is lost and recommends she be very careful since the location is actually quite dangerous. He also asks his companion to turn on the elevator, and Bundo at that moment refuses, since with a very malicious laugh he confesses that was never his plan. Also, the girl opens the bag she was carrying and pulls out a quite large sword, and confesses she is the leader of the 3rd platoon of Undertakers, who we come to know by the name Hibana Data. Nagi at that instant summons his branch of sin, and without thinking twice attacks the girl, but she uses her weapon to vanish his attack and manages to land a hit on the man. At that moment, Nagi realized the protagonist was right since there were indeed artifacts that counter the blood. And it was Bundo who had edited the video to make it look like Genkaku had dodged the attack. Nagi knows he must think of something fast and tries to attack her again, but the girl using her weapon beats him. The man knows he must simply lower the lever so the group can go up in the elevator. On the other side, the protagonist's group is dismayed seeing the elevator is still not coming down, so they wonder if everything is all right with Nagi. Back with Nagi, we see him cornering the little girl and telling her he will spare her life if she clearly apologizes. The man says he cannot overlook the insolence of a spoiled little girl. Hibana at that moment tells him she will use a technique called Lichi, which will allow her to kill him slowly, since the idea is to finish him off by tearing off small pieces of his flesh. At that instant, the little girl cruelly starts making many cuts all over Naga's body. The girl tells him it is a lady's duty to punish people, but Nagi tells her she cannot even be considered a lady since a real woman would not do this kind of thing. This leaves the girl very thoughtful as the man starts telling her she is a completely repulsive and raw person. This makes the girl recall when a woman had hanged herself because of her. So furiously she began attacking the man with tears in her eyes. After finishing beating him, we see the girl suddenly cuts part of his limb. Nagi forcefully tears it off completely and launches himself at the girl, and then goes toward Bundo and pins him against the wall. After knocking Bundo out, we see the boy activates his blood in the cut arm and equally lowers the elevator switch, making the protagonist's group happy to see he managed it. However, Nagi at that moment cannot hold on any longer and ends up collapsing. On the other side, the protagonist's group feels very happy since they will be able to show everyone the truth. However, after going up, we see a burst of bullets receives them at that moment. There was Genkaku with several guards who defended the man after receiving several attacks from the Deadman. Right away, they start killing the protagonist's group, and Ganta, not knowing what to do, is in complete shock at that moment. On the other side, we see Nagi manage to defeat the girl. However, he is on the ground, and Bundo at that moment tells him he was very lucky. Also, he does not think the boys from the elevator will get very far since the priests have come to back up the prison. And despite hearing these words, Nagi trusts the boys can complete the mission. Back with the protagonist, we see a man hands him the memory stick with the information and asks him to protect it with all his being. At that moment, a guard appeared and both ended up killing each other. The protagonist is stunned at that moment but recalls the words of Karako and Nagi as well, who dream of having freedom for all of them. This makes the protagonist lose his fear and says he must complete the mission. Also, we see Nagi through the communicator in his tooth start sending a signal, and in a parallel scene we see Shiro is a little hungry. And just when she arrives at the meeting place, she runs into a strange girl. Back with the protagonist, we see Genkaku manage to find him and mentions that when they dominate everything, they will only let a Deadman live. The protagonist starts making several attacks, but we see the man has a kind of invisible protective barrier. Just when Genkaku was about to fire at him, a man arrives to tell him they must leave now. The man leaves the protagonist and his other companions at the location without caring what they do. And just when Genkaku and his group left, Shiro suddenly appeared at the location. The girl asked him to hand over the memory stick with the data, And after throwing it somewhere, we see she closed the door and it ended up exploding since apparently it was a kind of trap she had created. At that moment, everyone was in shock and they start getting angry with the girl since they ask if she joined forces with the priests. But when the girl tried to explain this to them, they would not let her. The protagonist, completely disappointed in her, tells her many people put their faith and hope in him, not to mention there were a great many deaths. The girl tries to excuse herself, saying she only wanted to protect him, and the protagonist ends up punching her in the face, leaving the girl without words and very surprised. Also, the protagonist, very angry, tells her he never wants to see her again. A little while later, the group returns to the hideout, and we see Karako suddenly appeared. Everyone was happy to see the girl was still alive. After a long while, we see they treated her wounds, and she feels disappointed about clearly everything that happened. But despite this, they tell her she still has a little time since the inspectors have not left yet. The girl mentions she only needs to replace the memory sticks with the data and make it so at least one person manages to escape. She finally tells them she knows Nagi is still alive somewhere and will not give up even if it means risking her life. We just see Genkaku has Nagi tied to a chair since the man is playing several songs with his guitar. Nagi asks why he is letting him stay alive, and unexpectedly Genkaku extends an invitation for him to join them. In a scene change, we see Makina and her assistant are extracting as much information as possible from the prison. However, at that moment, the door starts opening so the girl has to hide immediately. At that moment, Tamaki comes in with another man and they sit down to talk about the namelerms since they want to find some way to synthesize them. Makina, who is spying on him, realizes the other man beside him is Major Yahi, who is the country's defense minister. Back with the protagonist, while he washes his head, he thinks about Shiro and gets angry for having ruined the entire plan. The group talks about how perhaps they were allowed to get to where they ended up because it did not matter to the Undertakers, since they literally had all the information about their plan leaked. And after thinking about it for a few minutes, the protagonist thinks he should recruit a boy who is known among them. But we see it is the very same boy who had been with Shiro minutes before ruining their plans. The protagonist tells him he can do everything in his power, but Karako makes him aware that fighting against an Undertaker is not as simple as he thinks, and this is why she is looking for someone who can. The protagonist starts feeling bad since he knows it was all his fault for letting the girl take the memory stick from him. But just at that moment, they are interrupted when Bundo suddenly enters the location. He asks who on earth was responsible for knowing the memory stick he had built was actually a bomb and should have killed all of them when they left the location. The protagonist is stunned at that moment since he hurt Shiro after she saved him from certain death. And in a parallel scene, Nagi tells him he flatly refuses to be part of the monster that killed his wife. But the man injects a substance into him and tells him he knows he is just like the Undertakers. Back with the protagonist, we see more of Bundo's companions arrived at the location since they plan to finish off each of them, and he points at the protagonist saying he will be the next to die, leaving Ganta completely nervous. On the other side, we see Shiro is very indignant since the person she had seen is named Todo, and it was Todo who informed them about the bomb. At that moment, the girl prefers to go eat some cookies, so she is indignant with Ganta. The girl at that moment has a memory of her caretaker. And what would the caretaker give her along with her favorite cookies? The girl always thought about sharing everything with Ganta. Back in the present, we see the girl picks up the cookies, and since she is upset mentions she will never share any with him again since the girl has quite a childish attitude. However, after eating several of them, she starts crying because of everything that happened with her friend. Back with Ganta, the protagonist does not know what to do since he is surrounded by people his abilities cannot affect. Bundo at that moment confesses to the protagonist he was the one responsible for editing the video in which he killed the students, and it was thanks to him he was brought to this prison. Finally, we see in front of the protagonist stand two quite maniacal people since Bundo starts narrating that one killed people after being raised by animals having been abandoned by his mother in the middle of the forest, and the other was equally a killer of girls. Just as they were heading to kill the protagonist, we see Senji appeared, and with a single slash finished off the man. Also, the rest of the boys start getting free, and Karako warns him not to touch their weapons since these dissolve their attacks. Bundo at that moment goes completely wild, so Senji pulls out his most powerful weapon and finishes off several guards with a single slash. This leaves Bundo trembling with fear, and finally Senji tells him he will finish him off by making several slashes at the speed of light. This even leaves all his companions stunned, since they cannot believe a human being can reach that speed. On the other side, we see Shiro is emotionally shattered from having received the protagonist's punch. Just at that moment, Todo appears in front of the girl, and Shiro tells her she does not understand how Ganta slapped her for having saved him. Back with Nagi, we see the man is making him suffer through medication he is injecting. Genkaku at that moment tells him to remember what happened after he killed his wife, since he reminds him he created a pool of blood after killing many people in the form of revenge. Because of the substances being given to him, Genkaku tried to plant false memories in his mind. Nagi at that moment starts falling into desperation, and mentions those were never his memories since he would never have killed innocent people out of revenge. Genkaku tells him that if he does not remember it clearly it is because he lost his sanity, so he welcomes him to the Maniacs Club. On the other side, we see the Deadman defeated all the priests, and the protagonist feels very bad since he tells them his friend only wanted to help them, yet he ended up hurting her physically. He even tells the group he feels totally pathetic for everything he has done. Kurako gives him a word of encouragement, mentioning that Deadman Wonderland is a prison that completely changes people, since if they arrive sane, they might come out without any sanity if they manage to leave at all. Kurako at that moment takes the opportunity to ask Senji to help them fight against the Undertakers and bring down this terrible prison since they need people as strong as him. However, Senji starts laughing while telling them there is not much difference from the outside world since there are lies and deceptions everywhere. The only difference is they are locked up here, and after saying these words he left. On the other side, Todo talks with Shiro and tells her she can trust her since she does not plan to do anything bad, or at least not to her. On the other side, we see the protagonist starts feeling very pathetic and understands that Shiro was right when she called him weak. The protagonist immediately arrives with Senji and asks him to teach him how to fight. He starts crying while telling him he knows if he were stronger he would not depend so much on the girl, and he wants to become strong enough to be able to hit those who call him weak. At that moment, Senji gets motivated and replies those were the words he wanted to hear. So he pulls out his branch of sin and asks one last time if he wants to fight against him, to which the protagonist in response cuts part of his finger and summons his blood power. In a parallel scene, we see Shiro continues talking with Todo. Shiro mentions that since the protagonist slapped her, the cookies do not taste the same, clearly meaning the girl is in a very bad emotional state. No matter how much the girl eats, she feels an emptiness in her stomach. Todo at that moment tells her not to take it so seriously if the protagonist decided to betray her. Finally, because Todo says some words about the protagonist, Shiro thinks she should go punch him the way he did to her. So she leaves very indignantly to go find the protagonist. Todo at that moment checks the chocolates the girl was eating and realizes they had a little alcohol in them, so we could say Shiro is heartbroken because she is a tiny bit drunk. On the other side, we see Kurako is telling them the new plan to bring down the prison, since they must try something a little different from before. At that moment, Bundo tells her there are not many chances their plan will succeed, but the girl puts on one of the disguises the guards were wearing and tells him she does not care if it goes well or badly, since the most important thing is not to sit with their hands crossed. While the girl leaves the location, we see she recalls when Nagi mentioned his wife wanted a photo to carry hanging with them, and the man showed her a collar that had no photo at all. But Nagi thought there was one since he had partly lost some of his sanity and was traumatized. Back with the protagonist, both continue training, and Senji tells him he must be much faster since, if it were a real combat, the protagonist would have died several times. He also asks for the protagonist's candies and immediately destroys them, keeping only one. He ties it to a small rope and asks him to attack him, and if he manages to get past his defenses, then he will have surpassed him. The protagonist immediately starts attacking, but the man blocked each one of the attacks. So Todo arrives by surprise at the location, and Senji is not very happy about this. The girl tells him she is looking for Shiro, who would come to punch the protagonist. Suddenly, the girl makes a move which pins Senji from behind. The girl tells him she knows she loves him and disgustingly licks a bit of his blood. Senji explains to us that Todo is known as a bloodthirsty warrior, and there are rumors indicating the girl is the most powerful Deadman of all. This leaves the protagonist without words since he thought Senji was actually the strongest. The girl wants a bit of the protagonist's blood and Senji stops her immediately since they are clearly in the middle of training. The girl at that moment formally introduces herself to the protagonist and then goes off to look for Shiro, but the girl leaves with a very malicious look. In a scene change, we see Genkaku is talking on the phone with Tamaki. At that moment, we see Genkaku is killing one of the guards. On the other side, we see Karako's group is infiltrated looking for an opportunity to carry out their plan. We see Shiro fall slightly drunk in the middle of all the guards. Everyone goes on alert and we see Genkaku suddenly appears. Karako, who is in disguise, tells him they will take her out since she is drunk. But suddenly, the man kicks her since he knew she was impersonating a guard. Back with the protagonist, Senji tells him they must stop, or the protagonist will end up with anemia since he has used a lot of blood. But the protagonist does not give up at that moment, so he launches one last drop of blood which is much smaller, but impacts powerfully, creating a shockwave throughout the entire location. Right after, we see the protagonist notices on television that Genkaku appears. He caught the girls and wants to take advantage of them, which immediately makes the protagonist run to go find them. This makes the Deadman watching the broadcast fall into desperation, seeing their friend had infiltrated alone. At that moment, the protagonist is stopped by some guards, and just then a branch of sin appeared and with a single slash finished off all the guards. And it was Minatsuki who managed to rescue the protagonist. The girl tells him they are now even and refuses to help the protagonist further. At that moment, the protagonist finally thanked her for saving him, and after saying goodbye, he keeps running. On the other side, the Deadmen finish off several guards at that moment, until the protagonist finally managed to reach where Genkaku was. Shiro, a little indignant, tells him she does not need his help, but the protagonist starts pulling out his branch of sin, and the guards laugh since they know it will have no effect on them. However, the protagonist manages to charge several attacks which hit the guards, but since the boy is very weak, Shiro gets worried and starts running toward him, all without expecting Hibana Data to suddenly appear, who with her weapon made the girl trip and hit against the wall. Just then, the protagonist tried to go to the girl, but after falling to the ground, Genkaku tells him it is time for the show. Right away, we see him start playing the guitar as some doors open behind him. Karako is stunned to see Nagi was inside. The girl tells him to come back together, but Nagi laughs since he managed to recover his sanity. He throws the collar with the supposed photo of his daughter to her and tells her he now knows there was never a photo. He also tells her Genkaku had confessed that when he killed his wife, she still had their child in her womb, which was when he was filled with rage and carried out an entire massacre. Also, we are shown a memory that Tamaki had taken the child's body and encapsulated it in the laboratory. At this instant, we see Nagi starts behaving like a complete maniac since he mentions humans do not deserve forgiveness and will finish off everyone. This makes the man summon his branch of sin and creates an entire explosion at the location. Genkaku at that moment tells him to let his inner demons out since that way he can avenge his wife's and children's death by wiping out everything in his path. And finally, we see Nagi summons many blood spheres which he will use to kill all the people. In a scene change, we see Yo is talking with Tamaki about the events that occurred. The man tells him about what has been happening with the blood spilling among the prisoners. Tamaki mentions he finds it entertaining to watch all those people fight for freedom. Back with the protagonist, we see Nagi has gone out of control and started attacking all the soldiers. Karako at that moment laments not having been able to help her friend much sooner, and right away Nagi heads to hit Shiro, and just as he directs his fist at her, the protagonist steps between both of them. Also, Ganta starts taking a beating to protect his friend. Karako tries to calm him down, and the protagonist equally tells him that when he was at his lowest, Nagi was the person who helped him, since Nagi himself had advised the protagonist not to seek revenge about the man in red and his classmates. However, Nagi, blinded by hate, thinks that now without his daughter he cannot live in peace. The protagonist starts telling him he understands his pain and it is not the same as his own, but he understands what it is to know a beloved person will never return. The man starts coming to his senses as the protagonist tells him there will always be a light around him. Nagi thinks he no longer has any hope, but just then he starts hearing the little bell on Karako's collar. The protagonist gets to his feet and tells him that despite having made mistakes, he does not plan to let him hurt his best friend. This makes Nagi change his thinking, but just at that moment the protagonist falls to the ground. Right away, we see the prisoner's collar the protagonist wears starts emitting a repetitive sound, and Ganta wonders when was the last time he ate a candy. On the other side, Karako slaps Nagi and he comes even more to his senses. The man tells him that the sound of her bell reminds him of companionship. Also, the girl gives him a hug and he lets out tears of happiness. But unexpectedly, when the girl moves away from him, she receives a blade to the side of her chest from Genkaku. Everyone at the location is in complete shock at seeing what was just done to the girl. At that instant, the protagonist sees a very sad scene between both of them and gets furious and launches a powerful attack at the man. This pushes him back from the impact, and Ganta launches a second attack which creates a very powerful shockwave throughout the entire location. But despite this, the man managed to block the attack. At that moment, the man tells him it is time to make him suffer. Karako is still conscious and covers her wound with her branch of sin ability, but the man tells him to kill her and he can continue with the plan since he knows Karako is in love with him. Despite Genkaku telling him to let out his inner demons so everyone can be killed, the man refuses at that moment, since thanks to the girl he managed to recover his strength and willpower and companionship, so he tells him he will have to get through him. And Genkaku, without thinking twice, fires a cannon shot into his stomach. He also starts killing each of the guards who were helping him. At an instant, we are shown a memory of when Genkaku was much younger. He was going about his business when several men came, and after getting him into a room, they ended up beating him up. And after a while, the boy went to see his master, and the master realized he had been fighting again, clearly not mentioning that he was actually beaten by several people. It was right on that day that the Great Red Hole catastrophe occurred, so he saw the men who had bothered him. And when his master came to see if he was all right, he found a very disturbing scene since Genkaku had dismembered the men who had beaten him. Back in the present, Genkaku keeps reciting that death is the only salvation. Just at that moment, the protagonist thinks he cannot do much because of the poison being generated by his collar. In a parallel scene, we see Hibana Data is withdrawing from the location while thinking she prefers to give up after everything she saw. At that moment, the girl ran into Todo, and after trying to attack ended up being killed since Todo's power is immensely great. Back with the protagonist, he laments not being able to do something for all the people the man just killed. But Genkaku mentions that sometimes it is more compassionate to end people's suffering since he plans to keep killing people until someone does the same to him. At that moment, we see the crystal the protagonist has in his chest starts glowing. The man starts reciting some words and suddenly Shiro prostrates herself before the protagonist. The man seems to recognize her and the protagonist does not allow the girl to defend him at that moment. Right after, we see a mark appears over the protagonist and Shiro, and the man very furiously tells him he will finish him off. Right away, the protagonist charges a powerful blood ball, and after launching it at the man, we see Nagi steps in to receive the impact himself since he tells him that now both of them will go to hell together. They then receive the powerful impact, which creates a gigantic hole at the location, and they head to where Nagi is, and see he is gravely wounded. The man asks the protagonist to take one of the candies he has since he knows he will die, and prefers the protagonist to keep living. After saying some final words, we see Nagi dies and Karako cannot hold on any longer and bursts into tears. And after a while, we see the protagonist ate the candy and waited for the girl to wake up. He also tells her he does not plan to leave a friend behind, and Shiro sees the carousel through the crack in the ceiling. The protagonist takes the chance to apologize for having hit her, and the girl at that moment tells him they should go ride the carousel. But the protagonist starts crying while looking at the wrapper of the candy Nagi gave him. The next day, we see Tamaki received a call from someone. At that moment, we see Makina is at the location, and the man tells her he cannot get used to being the new director since the old one had died in the fight against Shiro. The girl tells him that and the protagonist returned with very serious wounds, so she plans to interrogate both of them about everything that has happened. Since, if you recall, the girl had absolutely no idea about what goes on in the prison and Tamaki's plans. The man with a very evil laugh tells her he has no problem with whatever she does. And just when the girl withdraws from the location, we see Tamaki thinks the story he will tell them no one will believe. In a scene change, we see Todo is with the director's former guards looking at a photo of the protagonist when he was just a little boy, wondering what his flavor would be. Back with the protagonist, they are on top of one of the amusement park buildings. The girl at that moment was singing a song to him, and the protagonist tells her it sounds very familiar. Shiro tells him he certainly knows it since the protagonist's mother taught it to her. Ganta seems a little confused since he tells her the man in red was singing it when he killed all his classmates, so he asks how it could be possible for the man to know the song, clearly not knowing she is actually the man in red. And that is how this anime ends.